May 24, 1941. The North Atlantic is grey and restless. Cold spray lashes steel decks as two shadows emerge from the fog. One of them is enormous. 50,000 tons of German ambition. 8 guns the size of small houses. Armor thicker than any shell most ships can fire. This is Bismarck. She cuts through the water with quiet confidence, her engines steady, her crew trained to silence. Orders are brief, radios are restrained. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the British home fleet is searching, but here, for now, the sea belongs to her. Minutes later, gun flashes tear through the mist. A thunderclap echoes across the Denmark Strait. In less than 8 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy, HMS Hood, is gone, broken in half, burning, sinking beneath the waves with more than 1,400 men. Across Europe, shock ripples through command rooms and admiralty offices. A single German ship has rewritten the balance of naval power, if only for a moment. But power at sea is never permanent. And this moment will trigger one of the most relentless hunts in naval history. Because from this instant forward, the world's most feared battleship will become the most hunted ship on Earth. And to understand why Bismarck was here at all, we must step back into a wounded nation, a changing navy, and a world sliding toward total war. The story of Bismarck begins long before her hull ever touched water. It begins in defeat. In November 1918, Germany's high seas fleet, once the pride of the Kaiser, returned home in silence. The war was lost, the empire collapsed, and with it vanished Germany's claim to the world's oceans. The Treaty of Versailles followed with surgical precision. Germany was forbidden from possessing submarines. Battleships were limited in number and size. New construction was tightly controlled. For a nation that had measured its power in steel and tonnage, this was humiliation made permanent. Throughout the 1920s, the German Navy survived in name only, a coastal defense force, obsolete ships, agging crews, strategic irrelevance. Meanwhile, Britain retained the largest navy on Earth, its sea lanes stretching from Canada to India, from Australia to the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy was not just a military force, it was the backbone of an empire. But treaties age quickly in a world driven by resentment. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, rearmament followed almost immediately. At first, quietly, then openly, Germany withdrew from the League of Nations. Conscription returned, and the Navy, now renamed the Kriegsmarine, was handed a task both symbolic and strategic: reclaim Germany's presence on the open sea. In 1935, the Anglo-German naval agreement marked a turning point. Britain, seeking stability, allowed Germany to build a fleet up to 35% of Royal Navy strength. It was meant to control German ambitions. Instead, it legitimized them. German naval planners faced a dilemma. They could never outbuild Britain ship for ship. Not in time, not with available resources, but they didn't need to. What they needed were symbols, ships that could threaten British dominance, disrupt commerce, and force the Royal Navy to spread itself thin across vast oceans. The answer was the battleship. In 1936, design work began on a new class of capital ships. They would be larger than treaty limits allowed, heavily armored, fast enough to outrun stronger forces, powerful enough to destroy anything they could not escape. This was not merely engineering, it was ideology made metal. The lead ship would be named Bismarck, after the man who had unified Germany through iron and blood. The name was not subtle, it was a statement. Construction began at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg in July 1936. The hull rose slowly, watched by party officials and naval officers alike. Every plate of steel carried expectations far beyond its weight. When Bismarck was launched in February 1939, she was already a legend before firing a single shot. She displaced over 50,000 tons fully loaded. Her main battery consisted of 8 38-centimeter guns, capable of firing shells weighing over 800 kilograms. Her armor belt was among the thickest ever put to sea. She was designed to fight and survive. But beneath the celebration lay unresolved questions. Germany's naval doctrine was still divided. Some believed in decisive fleet battles, others argued for commerce raiding, and looming above all was a war that Germany was not yet ready to fight at sea. When war came in September 1939, Bismarck was not ready, still fitting out, still training her crew. While U-boats began their silent war in the Atlantic, the great battleship remained tied to the pier, a weapon waiting for a moment that had not yet arrived. That moment would come only when desperation met opportunity, and Germany chose to gamble its greatest ship against the world's most powerful navy. And that gamble would be shaped by the strategic reality facing both sides as the Atlantic became the lifeline of an embattled Britain. By 1940, the war at sea had become a contest of survival. Britain stood alone in Western Europe. France had fallen, Norway was occupied, the British Army had escaped at Dunkirk, but it had left its heavy equipment behind. What remained of Britain's strength depended on one thing above all else: the sea lanes. Every day merchant convoys crossed the Atlantic carrying food, fuel, ammunition, and raw materials. Without them, Britain would starve, its factories fall silent, its war effort collapse. Winston Churchill would later admit that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. Germany understood this, but Germany's navy was split between two visions of how to exploit it. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, believed in surface power. He envisioned heavy ships, battleships and cruisers, roaming the oceans, attacking convoys, forcing the Royal Navy to deploy its strength across multiple theaters. This was the logic behind Plan Z, a massive fleet expansion meant to challenge Britain directly, but Plan Z had been overtaken by events. War came too soon. The fleet was incomplete. Others, including Admiral Karl Dönitz, argued that submarines alone could win the Atlantic. U-boats were cheaper, harder to detect, and devastating when deployed in numbers. But in 1940, Germany did not yet have enough of them. So the Kriegsmarine compromised. Surface raiders would strike where they could, supported by supply ships hidden across the oceans. Heavy cruisers like Admiral Scheer and Admiral Graf Spee had already shown what a single ship could do. They sank or captured dozens of merchant vessels, forcing Britain to hunt them across vast distances. But those ships had limits. Bismarck did not. When fully operational, she represented something Britain could not ignore: a battleship capable of destroying any single British capital ship in a fair fight. Fast enough to outrun older battleships, tough enough to absorb punishment that would cripple lesser vessels. British intelligence tracked her carefully. Every movement in German ports was noted. A ship like Bismarck could not simply vanish into the Atlantic unnoticed. By early 1941, Germany's strategic situation was tightening. The Battle of Britain had failed to force a decision. Air power alone had not broken British resistance. The invasion of the Soviet Union was being planned, but until then, Britain remained an active enemy. Raeder pressed for action. The operation that emerged was Operation Regenbogen. Its goal was not fleet battle, it was economic warfare. Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, would break into the Atlantic, attack convoys, and draw British forces away from other theaters. The risks were obvious. If Bismarck were damaged, there would be few safe ports. If she were cornered, she would face overwhelming force. And if she were lost, Germany would lose not just a ship, but prestige. Hitler himself was uneasy. He had never fully trusted the Navy. Surface ships were expensive and irreplaceable, but Raeder argued that opportunity was fleeting. British forces were stretched thin. Success, even temporary, could have outsized effects. In May 1941, permission was granted. Bismarck completed her final trials in the Baltic. Her crew, over 2,000 men, trained relentlessly, gunnery drills, damage control exercises, long hours at action stations. Many were young, some had never seen combat. All understood that once they sailed, there would be no turning back. On the night of May 18, 1941, Bismarck slipped her moorings at Gotenhafen. She headed north, escorted through the Baltic, toward the narrow seas beyond. British reconnaissance would soon detect her. Neutral observers would report her passage. And the North Atlantic would become a battlefield once more. As Bismarck approached the open ocean, every assumption about her power, human, technological, and strategic, was about to be tested from multiple angles at once. Technological angle. Bismarck was not simply large, she was engineered to endure. Her designers expected her to fight outnumbered. Her armor scheme reflected that reality. A thick central belt protected engines and magazines. Sloped armor decks increased the chance that incoming shells would ricochet rather than penetrate. Compartments were heavily subdivided, intended to contain flooding even after multiple hits. Her main battery, 838cm SKC-34 guns, could fire accurately at ranges exceeding 30 kilometers. Paired with advanced optical rangefinders and centralized fire control, Bismarck could strike hard before an enemy could respond effectively. Yet her technology reflected an older era. Radar was present, but primitive. Gunnery still relied heavily on optics and visibility. In fog, smoke, or darkness, even the most powerful ship could be blinded. Bismarck embodied the peak and the limits of battleship design. Human angle. Inside the steel hull, life followed a strict rhythm. The crew numbered more than 2,000, sailors, engineers, gunners, signalmen. Many were barely out of training. Others were veterans of smaller ships. Together, they formed a floating city bound by discipline and routine. Living conditions were cramped. Hammocks were slung wherever space allowed. Heat built up below decks when engines ran at speed. Sleep came in short stretches. Fear was rarely spoken aloud, but it existed in the silence before action stations, in the tension during long hours at sea. Morale was high, pride ran deep. Serving aboard Bismarck carried prestige. The crew believed in their ship and in the idea that she was invulnerable. Belief, however, is not armor. Leadership angle. Command rested with Captain Ernst Lindemann, a professional naval officer with a reputation for precision and restraint. Above him stood Admiral Günther Lütjens, commanding Operation Rheinübung. Lütjens was cautious, methodical, and deeply conscious of risk. Their relationship reflected the tension within the Kriegsmarine itself. Lindemann believed in aggressive action. Lütjens believed in mission discipline. Their orders were clear: avoid unnecessary battle, strike commerce, preserve the ship. But war rarely respects intentions. As Bismarck pushed into the North Atlantic, these three forces, technology, human endurance, and command philosophy, began to intersect under growing pressure. And far beyond the horizon, British forces were already reacting, shaping another set of angles that would soon collide with Bismarck's fate. Enemy perspective. For the British Admiralty, the appearance of Bismarck was not just a threat, it was an alarm. The Royal Navy had fought for centuries to maintain command of the sea. Its doctrine was built on concentration of force and rapid response. A ship like Bismarck challenged both. She could outrun some British battleships, outgun others, and force the fleet to scatter in pursuit. When intelligence confirmed her departure, the reaction was immediate. Orders were issued across multiple commands. Patrols tightened in the Denmark Strait. Capital ships were recalled from distant duties. Even vessels under repair were rushed back to readiness. The loss of Hood would later confirm their worst fears, but even before that moment, Bismarck represented an unacceptable risk. She could not be allowed to roam free. Strategic angle. Operation Rheinübung was built on calculated restraint. Bismarck was not meant to seek glory. She was meant to threaten supply lines, draw enemy forces, and survive. But strategy at sea is fragile. Every refueling point, every course change, every radio transmission carried risk. British control of the Atlantic meant that German surface ships operated inside a hostile surveillance network. Air patrols, coastal observers, neutral shipping reports, all fed into a tightening net. Bismarck's power made her dangerous. Her isolation made her vulnerable. Moral angles. The battleship symbolized a belief that strength alone could impose order, that steel, firepower, and discipline could dominate space and time. But by 1941, warfare was changing. Aircraft could strike beyond the horizon. Intelligence could expose even the most carefully planned movements. Speed and adaptability mattered as much as armor. Bismarck sailed as a monument to an earlier vision of naval warfare, one that still commanded respect, but no longer guaranteed survival. As these realities converged, the North Atlantic narrowed, the fog lifted and closed again, courses intersected. And in the early hours of May 24, 1941, the abstract became immediate, when radar contacts turned into silhouettes and theory gave way to gunfire. Shortly before dawn on May 24, 1941, the Denmark Strait was cloaked in low cloud and drifting ice. Visibility was poor, the sea was cold, the horizon indistinct. At 05:37, British lookouts aboard HMS Suffolk reported contact, two large ships, bearing steady, speed high. Within minutes, the British battlecruiser HMS Hood and the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales altered course to intercept. Hood had been the symbol of British naval power for 2 decades, fast, elegant, and feared. But she was also lightly armored by modern standards, designed for an earlier kind of war. At 05:52, the opposing forces sighted each other through breaks in the mist. Ranges closed rapidly. Admiral Lutyens delayed opening fire, adhering strictly to orders. Captain Lindemann disagreed. The enemy was in range. Every second mattered. According to later accounts, Lindemann ordered Bismarck's guns to fire despite the hesitation, an act that would define the battle's opening moments. At 05:55, Bismarck fired her first full salvo in anger. The sea erupted. Columns of water rose like towers. The air shook with concussion. Shells weighing nearly a ton arced across the sky. Hood replied almost immediately. Her opening salvos straddled Prince Eugen, which had been mistakenly identified as Bismarck. Seconds later, Prince Eugen scored a hit on Hood, igniting a fire on her boat deck. Then, at approximately 06:00, Bismarck's fifth salvo found its mark. A shell penetrated Hood's thin deck armor near the aft magazines. The explosion was catastrophic. A blinding flash tore through the ship. Hood broke in two. Her stern lifted briefly, then vanished beneath the surface. From first sighting to destruction, less than 8 minutes had passed. Out of a crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. On the bridges of British ships, shock froze movement. Hood had been considered nearly invincible. Her loss was not just tactical, it was psychological. A symbol had been erased in seconds. Prince of Wales continued firing, scoring several hits on Bismarck. One shell damaged a fuel tank, causing a slow but critical oil leak. Another disrupted a boiler room, reducing speed. Bismarck had won the engagement, but at a cost. As smoke drifted across the strait and the surviving British ship disengaged, the reality became clear. The most feared battleship afloat was no longer pristine. And that damage would shape everything that followed, turning triumph into a countdown. The destruction of HMS Hood electrified the war at sea. Within hours, the order went out from the Admiralty: Bismarck must be sunk. Every available British asset was redirected. Battleships altered course. Cruisers closed in. Aircraft carriers were repositioned. From Gibraltar to Iceland, the net tightened. Bismarck, meanwhile, was already compromised. The fuel leak from the hit sustained during the Denmark Strait battle could not be fully contained. Oil trailed behind her, marking her path across the Atlantic. Speed was limited to conserve fuel. Lutyens now faced a decision that would define the ship's fate: continue the mission or break off. He chose withdrawal. Prince Eugen was detached to continue commerce raiding alone. Bismarck turned toward occupied France, aiming for the safety of Brest or Saint-Nazaire, but the ocean had become hostile in every direction. British cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk maintained contact, shadowing from a distance. Their radar, still crude but effective, allowed them to track Bismarck even in poor visibility. Every radio transmission narrowed her options. On May 25, contact was briefly lost. For several tense hours, Bismarck vanished into the Atlantic. British command feared the worst, that she might slip through and reach open conv routes. But the ocean leaves traces. On May 26, a Catalina flying boat from Coastal Command sighted Bismarck. The report was immediate: course, speed, position. By nightfall, the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal was within striking distance. What followed was a reminder that naval power was changing. Swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, fabric-covered biplanes, lifted off into heavy weather. They were obsolete by most measures, but they carried torpedoes, and they flew low. The first attack was confused, nearly disastrous. British pilots almost struck their own cruiser, HMS Sheffield, mistaking it for the enemy. Torpedoes were released and narrowly missed. The second strike came in worsening conditions. At 20:47, a torpedo struck Bismarck's stern. The explosion itself was not catastrophic, but its placement was decisive. The blast jammed Bismarck's rudders at an angle, locking the ship into a slow, uncontrollable turn. Efforts to free the rudders failed. Divers could not reach them. Emergency repairs proved impossible in heavy seas. Bismarck could still fight. She could still fire. But she could no longer escape. Through the night, she circled helplessly, broadcasting defiant messages to Germany. Lutyens reported the situation with clarity and resignation. There would be no rescue. At dawn on May 27, British battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in. At 08:47, they opened fire. For over an hour, Bismarck endured a punishment unmatched in naval history. Her superstructure was shattered, fire control was destroyed, guns fell silent one by one. Yet the hull refused to sink. Finally, torpedoes were launched at close range. German crew opened sea valves, scuttling the ship to prevent capture. At approximately 10:40, Bismarck rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. She had been at sea for just 8 days. And as the Atlantic closed over her, the age of the battleship suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. The Atlantic was silent. For hours, only the wind and the waves spoke. Where Bismarck had ruled the seas for 8 days, there was now emptiness. Of the more than 2,200 men aboard, only 115 survived. They clung to life in lifeboats or were rescued days later by German and neutral vessels. Their accounts were stark: chaos, fire, smoke, and a sense of inevitability as steel buckled around them. Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutyens went down with their ship, embodiments of discipline, courage, and fatalism. The British Royal Navy had won a costly victory. Losses had been minor compared to Bismarck's toll on Hood, yet the hunt had stretched resources to their limits. Battleships, cruisers, aircraft, and submarines had converged across the Atlantic, demonstrating both determination and the logistical complexity of modern naval warfare. The sinking was studied meticulously. Reports emphasized the effectiveness of combined arms, radar tracking, aircraft torpedo strikes, and coordinated surface gunfire. The engagement illustrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful battleships to intelligence, technology, and relentless pursuit. Public reaction was immediate and profound. In Britain, newspapers heralded the revenge for Hood. The Admiralty lauded its crews, reinforcing morale at a critical moment in the war. In Germany, the news was a blow to prestige. Propaganda had celebrated Bismarck as a symbol of invincibility. Now, the loss was acknowledged quietly, the narrative carefully framed to maintain morale. Strategically, Bismarck's destruction changed little in the short term. Convoy operations continued, but the psychological impact was significant. Germany lost not only a capital ship, but also a powerful symbol intended to challenge British naval dominance. Lutyens' cautious adherence to orders, balancing mission objectives with preservation, became a point of debate among naval historians. Could a different choice have prolonged her life, or was her fate inevitable once spotted by intelligence and aircraft? The Atlantic, vast and indifferent, reclaimed the wreck, and beneath its waves lay lessons in technology, human endurance, and the changing face of naval warfare, lessons that would resonate long after the guns fell silent. The sinking of Bismarck reverberated far beyond the Atlantic. For the Kriegsmarine, it marked a turning point. Germany's surface fleet would never again challenge British naval supremacy in the open ocean. The ambitious Plan Z, designed to create a balanced fleet capable of contesting the Royal Navy, was effectively abandoned. Battleships remained, but their strategic role shifted from high-seas raiding to coastal defense and training. The psychological impact was equally profound. The loss of Bismarck demonstrated that even the most formidable warship could be hunted, cornered, and destroyed. Technological advantages, radar, aircraft reconnaissance, and coordinated fleet tactics had proven decisive. Future naval planners worldwide took note. The era of the unsinkable battleship was over. Air power, intelligence, and mobility now dictated naval outcomes more than sheer armor and gun caliber. For Britain, the victory was both morale-boosting and instructive. Convoy protection, aerial reconnaissance, and fleet coordination were validated as effective countermeasures. The Royal Navy's ability to mobilize and concentrate overwhelming force became a template for future engagements. The hunt for Bismarck also underscored the importance of inter-service cooperation. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, and aircraft worked together to eliminate a single, highly capable target. Naval engineers analyzed the wreck extensively. Lessons in armor distribution, damage control, and vulnerability to torpedoes informed new designs. Crews studying Bismarck's final battle recognized the limits of even advanced battleships when isolated and deprived of adequate air cover. This understanding would influence shipbuilding and doctrine for the remainder of the war, as nations reconsidered the balance between speed, firepower, and protection. Culturally, Bismarck entered legend. Books, reports, and later documentaries highlighted the drama of her hunt, emphasizing heroism on both sides. The ship became a cautionary tale. Pride and power, untempered by adaptability, could be fatal. Yet within that cautionary narrative lay admiration for the ship, her crew, and the audacity of the operation. The Atlantic had claimed its prize, but the memory of Bismarck would endure as a symbol of the climax of battleship warfare. By late 1941, Germany's focus had shifted entirely to submarines. The U-boat campaign would dominate the Atlantic, but no vessel carried the symbolic weight or operational potential of Bismarck. The fleeting dominance she achieved was a stark reminder. Even the mightiest warship is vulnerable, and the dynamics of modern warfare had irrevocably changed. As the sea closed over her wreck, the lessons of her rise and fall were clear. Strength alone could not secure victory. Strategic insight, technological adaptation, and coordinated action mattered more than any single ship. And the story of Bismarck, brief, brilliant, and tragic, would become a benchmark against which all future naval power was measured. Bismarck's story is more than steel and firepower. It is a meditation on ambition, vulnerability, and the fleeting nature of dominance. In just 8 days, a vessel designed to command oceans became a hunted relic, reminding the world that no matter the size of a ship, no matter the skill of its crew, the sea is unforgiving and war is unpredictable. The battleship had long been a symbol of national pride, a floating monument to power. Bismarck embodied the pinnacle of this vision: armor that could deflect shells, guns that could obliterate foes, and speed that could outpace nearly all adversaries. Yet her demise illustrated a profound shift. Technology, intelligence, and the integration of air and naval forces had begun to overshadow sheer tonnage and firepower. The era of the unsinkable ship was over, adaptability and coordination had become decisive. Beyond tactics and strategy lies the human element. The crew of Bismarck lived and fought within steel walls, disciplined and courageous, yet ultimately subject to forces beyond their control. Admiral Lütjens and Captain Lindemann executed their duties with professionalism and courage, yet their fate was sealed by circumstance and the unforgiving calculus of war. Their story reminds us that history is shaped not only by machines, but by the people who operate them, who endure, and who make choices under pressure. Finally, Bismarck endures in memory as both a caution and a marvel. Her brief reign over the Atlantic demonstrates the paradox of power, immense, awe-inspiring, yet ultimately impermanent. She is a monument to human ingenuity and ambition, a testament to the evolution of warfare, and a stark reminder of the human cost that accompanies conflict. And as the Atlantic waves continue to cover her resting place, Bismarck remains a symbol, a reminder that dominance is never guaranteed, that pride is never unchallenged, and that even the mightiest can fall in the relentless theater of war.